You can make it bigger than that, by the way. So this is the other interesting thing about Farley. There's a golden point. So Chinese inch is usually the best because your structure is usually much more solid in that short space. The bigger the movement, the harder it is then to suddenly stop everything dead. And it's not harder to stop it dead, but the structure itself is bigger. So a more compact structure is like a kind of denser structure, so it transmits the force a little bit better. But of course, most people are usually further away than that. So a punch is a bigger structure. The biggest movement you can probably get away with is, let's say, something like a cross. And that's a little bit of an illusion because the shoulders are moving forwards as you cross. So they're making this distance shorter anyway as you move in. So it's kind of an illusion that you're covering all of this space anyway. You're not, and also you lean in, you push back off your rear foot and you push in. So you make it a much smaller movement. And that's still well within that golden ratio where you want to generate kinetic force with an explosive movement, because under a certain length, it's not big enough. Under a Chinese inch, it's not big enough to generate the kinetic movement, the kinetic force from the movement. The movement isn't big enough. And if your hands are on and you do brace Farley, you've got to articulate it back into your body, by the way, that's where it goes. If it starts getting bigger and bigger and bigger, you can get to about this big, then after a certain point, you can't maintain that velocity over the distance. It's not that kind of movement. And the classic example of this is a kick, where most of the kick is what we call travelling distance. And I do exercises on the bag, and I filmed some that I can show, where you can see actually, Yiquan kicks are they're absolutely textbook sandar kicks, so that's really fed into sandar, that kicks are done like that, where the knee comes up quite high and then you explosively move out like that. Most of the travelling distance in a Yiquan kick is the leg coming back towards you. For a higher kick, let's say mid-range kick, it's different for a low round kick or something like that. But if you say you're front kicking someone in the stomach, most of that distance is the leg lifting up, not even going in the same direction as the target. The actual Farley is like the little bit at the end. So most of it is travelling distance and then explosively moving. Or there's an explosive jump. It's what we call compound Farley that we've looked at before. There's an explosive lift up off the floor of the leg, but then it's usually the knees going up and then the kick goes out, say for a front kick. So the Farley is right at the end, a small part of the movement, and the rest of it is just travelling distance, because that movement is too big, a kick, for the whole thing to be Farley. You can't do it in, it's too big a space to do it in. After the sudden burst of explosiveness of the rear foot, springs up off the floor, it dissipates, and then it's travelling distance, and then you do it again. That's why it's a compound Farley. It will dissipate over a distance like that, so you can't do it like that. So it's all got to be done in a short space anyway. But to make it work like with your hands, the amount of time that a person's structure is infected with disruption, we call it infecting their structure. And this is what we're doing when we're training. When we do Farley, what we're doing is disrupting our own structure incredibly dynamically. What we want to do is transfer that disruption into the opponent. So let's say we're doing push hands and we disrupt them one way, and then we want to change and immediately hit them while their structure is disrupted. But they will have recovered from that disruption in a second. And that's why the movement's got to be 1-2. And that's why we've got to train this structural movement so that we can do this kind of double, triple Farley, that we can do it very, very quickly. And this, by the way, I'll come back to all of this stuff, but this is the real meaning when we say winning 3 movements. Yao Zhongzun says, it's ridiculous that people have thought of this in terms of, you should win a fight in 3 moves. Otherwise, you don't really know each one. You still see people talking like this now. It doesn't mean that at all. It's talking about the way an individual posture functions in each one. So movement number 1 is to bridge the gap between you and them, what we call guard breaking. Movement number 2 is to disrupt their structure. So let's say release force and push their guard over to the side. And movement number 3 is the hit. And if you manage to get all of those 3 in, then you've won that exchange, you've won that in 3 moves. If you start going anywhere beyond that, let's say you get to point 2, you close the distance, you release force and disrupt their guard, but then they counter that. Then that exchange is over. Now you've got to start again. But you probably, if you're already in contact, now you can win within 2 moves. Change the structure the other way, and then release force, 1, 2. You can win within 2 moves. And that's what that means. If you're at a distance, you've got to close the distance, that's the first move. But if you're hands-on like with push hands, it's win within 2 moves. If you don't win within that second move, then it resets and then you're on, you've got to go again, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. There's nothing to say that you can't just punch them straight in the face. I know that. That's not the idea. The original idea wasn't that though. And this is why Wang Xianjia is talking about Yiquan as a self-defense thing. The original idea is, what if I'm facing this massive dude who's miles stronger than me, and if I punch him in the face, it's really going to do nothing? What's the solution to that? If putting muscles on isn't going to solve that problem. This is like this weird thing that's kind of taken over Chinese martial, maybe not in China, but certainly how people talk about traditional martial arts in the West now, about it all being about strength and all being about muscles. And I find it's quite interesting that it's very often the same people who kind of slag off contemporary wushu. And it's like, contemporary wushu people are so much stronger than these people, like, you wouldn't believe it. So how do you solve that problem? Like, if I just punch him in the face, he's just going to look at me and laugh. So that's what Wang Xianjia is thinking, how do I solve that problem? I'm going to punch him in the face and it's going to do nothing, so I have to move him first. So that's why they start developing these ideas, and also that's why you start seeing these big movements like that. That's the idea, you're taking down someone's guard and hitting them. But what we want to do is get that shorter and shorter and shorter. And if you get that right, that's when it starts looking like amazing. And people are like, wow, how do you even do that? Like, but all that stuff, like, it's so different to the conversations that people are having about father. Like, people are so lost around this, and it's such a shame because we've got all this like incredibly rich stuff in Chinese wushu that's just getting drowned out by this other stuff. Clarity has become people's enemy. That they think like, that's it. I've got the solution, I've got it. Like, it's about power. No, that just leaves you right back in the position that Wang Xianjia was in. Well, actually, there's a limited amount of power. This is also the other interesting thing, isn't it? That people imagine that Wang Xianjia had this like ridiculous level of power. He tells you himself it's not about that. It's not about just a simple punch to the face and it's so powerful. And this is why you see some of these modern, what they call them, hanshi. Well, this hanshi's like all, I suppose. There's no such thing as Han's Yiquan, there's no such thing as Yao's Yiquan, there's just your Yiquan, right? But some of these people in America, some of these Hawaii-based people, Hanshi Yiquan, where they've reimagined this idea that they can develop some kind of magic power that they can hit you with. Obviously, they can't demonstrate it. Obviously, they can insult people who don't believe it, but I mean, that's Yao's Yiquan. Stuff that Yao's Yiquan people say is so despicable. Western Yao's Yiquan people who point out completely obvious falsehoods and bullshit that they're talking, and then the way that they speak to people is just disgusting. And the way that they threaten people, I hate them. I hate Yao's people. I hate Han's people. I hate them. The way that they behave is just absolutely appalling. They're despicable. I hate them and I laugh at them. But these people have reimagined it as some kind of magical skill they've inherited from Shaolin. In their minds, they live in shame because they know that that's not real. But it's also not what Wang Xianjia was talking about. The solution that he came up with was so brilliant that we're still talking about it. That there's still some, these Soviet boxers that could do this, that we still think is like, wow. It's probably where Systema came from originally, which, is a whole other thing. The idea that if you just disrupt someone's structure and then hit them, then you get this force magnification effect. And if you can position yourself and drill yourself to position yourself relative to them, so you do that when they're in the most off-balance position, you can create these incredibly dramatic effects that look like magic. Here's the problem though, when that doesn't work, then you're in trouble if you've got nothing else. And this is the problem with that, when it was being used in Soviet boxing, is that when people worked out what that was, then they could immediately prevent it from happening. So if you haven't got further fight skills, if you haven't gone through this process of emergence, if you're just relying on that, and this is the problem that Wang Xianjia students, particularly Yao Zhongzhong, recognised with Wang Xianjia himself, that actually that on its own is not enough. That's not enough to carry forwards into the modern world. So you've got to expand along the infinite curriculum and think about, well, what happens now if I miss? Or how can we take these ideas? Structural movement's got a lot of other applications that we can use. How do we take those and explore those as well? Because actually there's so much more. Once you've developed that kind of structural movement, there's so much more you can do around that. How do we explore that and take that and build it into bigger fight skills? And like most of what you need in terms of the fight training, that's not even what we would even count as Yiquan. Yiquan's like the application, it's these core things that we then apply across the Infinite curriculum. It's absolutely fascinating how we've come to this point that people are saying like, well, you know, the highest level example of Chinese martial arts is Japanese martial arts or Western martial arts, and you can imagine people like Wang Shenzhai, all those people who are writing, you know, with all due respect to those martial artists, right? Wang Shenzhai would be turning in his grave at that idea, you know, because it erases the achievements of Chinese physical culture. And I'm not to say that's racist, but it is imperialist. It absolutely is imperialist. But we've got absolutely no chance of reversing that with a current crop of dancers who are, you know, presenting themselves as Yiquan masters. They're doing this other thing now, by the way, where they're like, because they're in their because they've been training for 30 years and now they're old, they've kind of got away with it, that they never have to like actually demonstrate anything practically because they're too old. They're too old and too out of shape. So there's another kind as well that I just wanted to mention briefly, and I think people know who it is, where there's, you know, an online course in Yiquan, which is just, honestly, it's shameful, right? So you've got someone who's just openly admitting that he can't use his Yiquan practically in any way, shape or form. Just saying like, actually, when it comes to sparring, I can't use it. I can't actually fight with it. But then he says, but I really want to be an Yiquan master and make a living out of that. And he's got people kowtowing to him, taking formal disciples. Someone had put a comment saying, oh, don't listen to those mouth boxers who are slagging you off. That's not mouth boxing. People say that's what he actually said, that he can't fight, but he wants to make a living out of it, he wants money from it.